The text message arrived on my phone screen at exactly 3:45 in the afternoon. I was standing on stage in front of 260 infrastructure professionals, mid-sentence, explaining why the proposed water main project had an 84% chance of structural failure within its first decade. The massive projection screen behind me displayed my custom risk correlation matrix, the exact statistical model that had saved our municipal engineering division $5,600,000 the previous year by catching fatal design flaws before the city signed any binding contracts. My phone lay face-up on the wooden podium, and I watched the words crawl onto the lock screen while voices in the room went quiet, waiting for me to continue explaining why local geological formations mattered so much in timeline projections. I scanned the third row of the auditorium and found Diane Crawford sitting there. She wore that expression of cold, passive satisfaction that I had memorized over the last 30 months. It was the same look she gave me when she moved my desk to the dark basement office with no windows, and the same look she wore when she presented my 52-slide Jefferson Street analysis to the city council without mentioning my name once, earning herself a standing ovation and a formal commendation. She was not trying to hide her hostility. It was open, deliberate, and designed to remind me of where she thought I belonged in the municipal hierarchy. She had pretended she could not attend the conference due to a sudden family emergency, allowing me to travel alone, only to secretly fly out and sit in the audience to watch my presentation. My phone buzzed a second time on the podium. The second text was even more direct. It stated that conference hotels were expensive, and she hoped I had budgeted appropriately. I was 2,600 miles from home, standing on a stage, representing a division whose actual technical work she had never understood but had claimed entirely as her own. She had cut my return flight and canceled my hotel reservation, leaving me stranded in Dallas with no ticket and no city-sponsored accommodation for the remaining days of the event. She expected me to panic, to stumble over my words, or to publicly break down under the stress of the situation. I took a slow breath, closed my laptop, and unplugged the display cable. The room fell into a deep silence as the projection screen went dark. I looked at the audience, found Gary Miller in the middle rows, and spoke into the microphone. I apologized to the crowd, stating that I had to step away due to an urgent matter, and noted that the distributed handouts contained the complete risk analysis methodology. Then I walked off the stage, gathered my briefcase, and walked straight through the double doors into the quiet hotel corridor. The cool air of the hallway felt clean compared to the stifling atmosphere of the presentation hall. Diane did not know that I had been preparing for a moment like this for 9 months. I had not predicted she would cancel my flight, but I had learned exactly who she was, what she was capable of, and how fragile her authority actually was when subjected to close inspection. I had spent 4 years at an engineering startup that collapsed slowly, leaving me with 3 months of bounced paychecks and a desperate need for stable, predictable work. Municipal bureaucracy had seemed like the perfect refuge. I wanted to show up, run calculations, analyze proposals, and go home without any administrative drama. When Diane Crawford first interviewed me, she seemed like a reasonable supervisor. She had 20 years of established relationships within the city administration and spoke confidently about collaborating on future infrastructure projects. But during my first week on the job, she handed me a massive bridge proposal and told me to run the numbers to see if anything stood out. I spent 6 days on it, analyzing material specifications and geological surveys. The contractor had assumed concrete would cure in conditions that violated basic physical laws, and their cost estimates completely ignored the bedrock composition documented in the Regional Geological Survey. I wrote an 18-page engineering assessment explaining why the project would run 50% over budget and fail safety inspections before completion. Diane read my report, called me into her office, and told me it was excellent work. Then she suggested that, because I was still adjusting to the department, it would be better if she presented the findings to the city council herself. I was new and assumed this was standard mentoring. She presented every word of my analysis as her own. The council rejected the proposal. The city saved millions, and Diane received the city manager's quarterly commendation. My name was not even mentioned in the footnotes. Over the next 30 months, this became our standard operating procedure. I would spend weeks modeling risk factors for wastewater facilities, library renovations, and stormwater drainage systems, producing detailed technical assessments. Diane would read them, praise my diligence in private, and then present them in executive meetings that I was never invited to attend. She was building a reputation as a visionary technical leader on the back of my quiet labor in the basement. But she made a critical error. The city's field engineers and project managers began to notice the depth of the analysis in the official reports and started calling me directly for technical details. They did not care about hierarchy. They cared about concrete, steel, and soil. I answered their questions honestly, walked them through my math, and never claimed expertise I did not possess. I was building a quiet network of professional respect, one calculation at a time, completely out of Diane's sight. I documented every project, keeping my original reports with secure digital timestamps, and archiving all communication with city officials to establish an indisputable record of my work. The network grew organically because the people doing the actual work needed accurate data. Gary Miller, a senior civil engineer who had spent decades managing city projects, called me one afternoon about a major stormwater drainage proposal. He mentioned that Diane had told the city council the project was low risk, but something about the contractor's flow calculations felt wrong to him. He asked if I had looked at the raw numbers. I pulled up my files and explained that the contractor's calculations assumed uniform sandy loam soil across the entire site. However, the Regional Geological Survey documented a dense clay layer at a depth of 14 feet. That clay would act as an impermeable water barrier, meaning the entire area would experience severe flooding issues within 3 years of completion. It was a basic geological oversight that any qualified engineer should have caught, but Diane had simply skipped the technical appendices. Gary was quiet for a long moment before telling me that Diane had presented a 3-page summary to the council, claiming the project was completely safe, with only minor modifications required. I told him that I had written a 21-page assessment specifically flagging the clay layer and recommending rejection of the proposal. Gary had never seen that report. He had only seen Diane's sanitized summary. He thanked me for the explanation, and I knew that he had begun to realize the extent of the misrepresentation occurring at the top of our department. I recalled another project where Diane had behaved in a similar fashion. It was a wastewater treatment facility upgrade that had occurred 12 months prior. The contractor had proposed using budget-grade control valves to save costs. My engineering assessment showed these specific valves had an incredibly high failure rate in high salinity environments, which would cost the city millions in premature replacements and emergency maintenance. I recommended requiring industrial-grade stainless steel valves. Diane deleted my warnings and submitted a brief memo, claiming the proposed valves were fully compliant. The contract was signed, and 6 months later, the valves began to corrode, forcing the city to allocate emergency funds to replace them. This pattern proved that Diane was not just taking credit for my writing. She was actively altering my technical conclusions to make proposals look more favorable to contractors. She wanted to appear collaborative and cooperative to the big developers and senior city officials, using my credentials and analysis to shield herself from the consequences of her decisions. When I recommended rejection due to structural risks, she watered it down to approval with minor conditions. I knew a direct confrontation would be professional suicide. She had 20 years of political capital and administrative alliances, while I was just an analyst working in the basement. I needed something stronger than a simple complaint. I began documenting everything with absolute precision. Every time I completed an assessment, I saved the original file with a secure digital timestamp. Every time I had a technical conversation with a city official, I sent a detailed summary via email to establish a clear paper trail. When Diane announced that I would represent the division at the National Infrastructure Conference in Dallas, I was surprised. She usually guarded public visibility fiercely. But 2 days before our scheduled departure, she announced a sudden family emergency. and said she could not attend, leaving me to handle the presentations alone. I spent the flight preparing my materials, focusing on real examples of risk modeling from projects I had personally assessed. The presentation went smoothly until the text messages arrived. Diane had not stayed behind because of an emergency. She had secretly traveled to Dallas and sat in the back of the room to watch me present, then cut my travel booking mid-presentation to force me into a panic. She wanted to see if I would beg for assistance or make a public scene that she could use to justify my termination. Instead of panicking, I walked out of the auditorium and found George Pearson sitting in the hotel lobby 30 minutes later. George was the Senior Vice President of Municipal Contracting for the Regional Oversight Board, the organization responsible for certifying public entities to bid on major regional projects. He had been watching my presentation from the back of the room before I walked out. We sat in the lobby, and I explained the situation to him. I did not raise my voice or show anger. I simply opened my laptop and showed him the original time-stamped engineering assessments, the emails containing my technical warnings, and the 3-page summaries Diane had submitted to the City Council. I showed him the stormwater calculations that predicted the flooding and the council minutes where Diane claimed the project was low risk. George read through the files in silence, his expression hardening as he reviewed the data. He looked up and noted that misrepresenting engineering risks to public bodies was a serious matter, bordering on fraud. He asked why I had not brought this forward earlier. I explained that in a municipal bureaucracy, an entry-level analyst accusing a veteran department head of falsifying reports is rarely believed without overwhelming evidence. I told him I was no longer interested in protecting her reputation and asked him to remember our conversation. He handed me his professional card and told me to stay in touch, suggesting that changes were coming to the regulatory landscape. I could not afford the $350 a night hotel room on my personal credit card, and Diane had booked a non-refundable, non-modifiable ticket that was now useless. I called Gary Miller, who was sharing a room with 2 other engineers, and asked if they had space. One of their colleagues had canceled at the last minute, and Gary told me I could use the extra bed. That night, I met Timothy Vance, an infrastructure analyst from Seattle who was staying in the same room. We stayed up late talking about statistical modeling and comparative risk analysis. I showed them my original assessments and the modified versions Diane had submitted. Timothy was impressed by the rigor of my work and asked why my name was not on any of the official publications. Gary shook his head, noting that the city had been making multi-million-dollar decisions based on what they thought was Diane's expertise, when it was actually mine. Timothy and I discussed specific project risk tools, comparing Seattle's modeling software with the proprietary statistical spreadsheet I had built in my basement office. We talked in detail about the mathematical formulas required for project risk reviews, focusing on how log normal distribution curves could model weather delays and how joint probability distributions could predict structural failures. Timothy noted that the Seattle division had been searching for an independent firm to audit their public procurement pipeline to prevent political bias. He suggested that I should start my own independent consulting practice, pointing out that municipalities would pay premium rates for accurate risk assessments. I hesitated, noting that I lacked the senior credentials typically required for independent work. Timothy replied that 2 years of documented, accurate assessments that saved cities millions of dollars was a far better credential than any title. He explained that many cities were beginning to outsource their critical reviews to avoid internal political bias, and an independent expert with a proven track record of accuracy would be highly sought after. I returned home after a 40-hour journey involving long bus rides and standby flights. I spent hours sitting in cramped bus terminals in small transit towns, drinking stale coffee at 2 in the morning, watching other travelers sleep and reflecting on the situation. The physical exhaustion only served to sharpen my mental focus. I was not angry. I felt a deep, steady calm. I knew that my mathematics were solid, while Diane had nothing but empty political promises and borrowed authority. I watched the dawn break over the highway, realizing that the long hours in transit were a small price to pay for the clarity I had gained. When I walked into the office, I found that Diane had moved my files into cardboard boxes in the hallway and taken over my desk. She told me she was reorganizing the division and that my new workspace would be in the basement, claiming it would be better for my focus. She wanted me out of sight, unable to speak with city officials or build relationships that might threaten her position. I agreed without arguing, carried my boxes down to the windowless basement, and continued my work in silence. The basement office was damp and poorly lit, with thick pipes running across the low ceiling and a fluorescent light fixture that hummed continuously. The walls were made of rough, unpainted cinder blocks that wept moisture during heavy rainstorms, and I had to place a plastic sheet over my computer monitor at night to protect it from condensation dripping from the pipes above. It was meant to be a punishment, a way to break my spirit and force me to resign. Instead, it became my sanctuary. For the next 9 months, I worked quietly in that space. I answered every call from contractors and city engineers who needed technical help. When a contractor asked why their proposal had been rejected, I did not give them a generic bureaucratic response. I walked them through my assessments page by page, explaining how concrete curing times and soil conditions affected their construction schedules. They began to respect my honesty and technical depth, often asking if I did independent consulting. Meanwhile, the stormwater drainage project that Diane had approved began to fail. A series of heavy autumn rains caused severe flooding across the development site, exactly as my original assessment had predicted. The clay barrier at 14 feet prevented the water from draining, trapping millions of gallons on the surface and threatening the integrity of the surrounding infrastructure. The city was suddenly facing $3 million in emergency repair and redesign costs. Diane tried to blame the contractor, claiming they had deviated from the approved design specifications. But Gary Miller called me from the field, asking if I still had a copy of my original report. I sent him the 21-page document within 5 minutes. It clearly detailed the clay layer, included the geological surveys, and warned that flooding was inevitable under the contractor's design. It proved that the contractor had built exactly what was approved and that Diane had ignored the warning. Gary took my report directly to the city manager's office. 2 weeks later, I received a formal request from the administration, asking for all my original unmodified engineering assessments from the past 24 months. I compiled 95 separate reports, hundreds of pages of calculations, and sent them directly to the investigators. I knew the bureaucratic gears were finally turning, and I went back to my basement office to wait. I continued my daily routine, running numbers and documenting anomalies, knowing the paper trail I had constructed was about to become the center of a major administrative storm. The city's internal investigation lasted 9 weeks. The investigators reviewed 18 major projects approved over the previous 2 years. My records showed that I had recommended rejection or significant structural modifications on 10 of those proposals. Diane had overridden my recommendations on 7 of them, and 4 of those projects were now experiencing serious structural or operational failures, costing the city $10 million in repairs. During the audit, the city's legal team discovered that Diane had gone beyond simply summarizing my findings. She had actually used my professional engineering stamp and forged my signature on the final approval documents she submitted to the city council, attempting to make it look as though I had certified the designs she altered. When the city attorney presented these forged documents to the city manager, the entire investigation shifted from an administrative review to a criminal inquiry. This action fell directly under California Penal Code Section 470, which covers the forgery of professional signatures and the falsification of public records. The legal team determined that because the contracts had been awarded based on forged and fraudulent engineering documents, the agreements were void ab initio. They were legally invalid from the very beginning. The city manager called me up to her 5th-floor executive office to discuss the situation. The contrast between my windowless basement office and her spacious, mahogany-lined office was stark, reflecting the division of power in the organization. The city manager was visibly shaken by the scale of the forgery. She asked why I had not come forward sooner. I told her honestly that as an entry-level analyst facing a department head with 20 years of relationships, I would not have been believed without the extensive documentation I had gathered. She nodded in agreement. Recognizing the institutional barriers that protect senior officials, the city manager asked if I intended to press criminal charges against Diane. I responded that my primary goal was to have the engineering truth officially documented, and that I would leave the criminal prosecution decisions to the district attorney and the city administration. She appreciated this strategic calmness, noting that it showed a professional focus on public safety and technical integrity rather than personal vengeance. The city attorney explained that declaring the contracts void ab initio allowed the city to terminate the agreements immediately without paying cancellation penalties, saving taxpayers millions. However, it also exposed Diane to direct legal liability for breach of fiduciary duty. The developers, facing massive financial disruptions, threatened to sue, but the city's legal counsel pointed out that because the forgery was committed solely by Diane without authorization, the liability fell squarely on her and her professional indemnity bond. This revelation created a wave of distrust between local developers and the planning division, forcing many contractors to audit their own internal submittals. The city council had to hold an emergency closed-door session to handle the void ab initio status of the contracts, and the local press began asking difficult questions about the integrity of the department's reviews. Diane tried to defend herself during the closed council meeting by claiming the discrepancies were due to minor technical glitches, but this defense was immediately refuted by the digital timestamps. When Diane realized the audit was accessing the raw server files, she attempted to delete the records from the shared drive, only to discover that I had already archived the originals with secure digital signatures on a regional database that she could not access. While the city manager's office prepared its legal case, George Pearson called me. The Regional Oversight Board was introducing new certification requirements for municipal contracting. Every division bidding on major public works had to employ certified risk assessors, and the certification was tied to the individual analyst rather than the department. George invited me to join the Certification Review Board part-time, working 3 days per month to evaluate the technical competency of applicants. I accepted the position. It paid a modest stipend, but it gave me a formal title and professional legitimacy certified by the regional board. 9 months later, the new certification rules went into effect, and every lead analyst in the region was required to submit their credentials, methodologies, and samples of their work for review. Diane Crawford was forced to apply to keep her department qualified to bid on regional contracts. She submitted an application listing herself as the lead technical assessor for every major project in our division over the last 2 years. She included my analysis of the Franklin Bridge, my stormwater calculations, and even sections of the slides I had presented in Dallas as examples of her own work. Her application docket landed on my desk 3 weeks later. I reviewed the pages of stolen calculations and plagiarized text. I informed George Pearson that I had a clear conflict of interest and should recuse myself. But George insisted that I was the only board member who understood the technical reality of the files. He assured me that an independent panel would verify my findings, but he needed my initial technical review to guide the process. I scheduled Diane's technical competency interview for a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after she submitted her application. She walked into the boardroom wearing a tailored suit, carrying an expensive leather portfolio, and wearing that same confident smile. She did not know that George Pearson was the board chair, nor did she know that he and I had met in Dallas. She assumed the interview was a mere administrative formality before her approval was stamped. We sat across the long mahogany table, and I began the interview by asking her to walk us through the risk modeling for the Riverside Development Project, which she had listed as a primary example of her personal methodology. Diane smiled and began delivering a polished explanation of contractor track records and weather scheduling, using the exact framework I had developed in the basement. I interrupted her politely. and asked her to explain the concrete curing calculations on page 7 of the submission. Her smile faltered slightly as she replied that she generally focused on strategic risk management and left the routine mathematical details to her junior staff. I pointed out that her application specifically listed her as the primary technical assessor who had personally performed all calculations. I displayed the original Riverside document on the screen, showing my handwritten margin notes and the specific temperature formulas. I asked her to explain how she had calculated the curing times under variable temperature conditions. She could not answer. She tried to deflect by talking about her 20 years of experience in municipal relations. But when pressed on the mathematics and material science, she had nothing to offer. She did not understand the underlying statistical distributions or the physical limitations of the materials. Specifically, I asked her to explain the probability density function we used to model the timeline delays and how she had calculated the variance in concrete strength under high moisture conditions. I pointed to the Monte Carlo simulation equations on the shared display screen, explaining the variables for task duration and probability distribution curves. She stared at the screen, her lips parted slightly, unable to even identify the variables or explain what a standard deviation meant in the context of the timeline model. She tried to assert seniority, claiming she had been managing municipal projects since before I entered college, but George Pearson quietly interrupted her, noting that long experience does not excuse a lack of technical knowledge. The interview lasted 60 minutes. Diane left the room with her portfolio, clutched tightly against her chest, her confidence entirely gone. After she left, the independent panel members who had joined by video conference commented on the extreme contrast between the clarity of my engineering work and her inability to explain basic formulas. That evening, I wrote a detailed technical assessment of her interview, noting that she had failed to demonstrate basic competency in the methodology she claimed to have authored. I attached my original timestamped files and the emails proving she had plagiarized my work, along with the documentation of the forged signatures that the city investigators had uncovered. The independent review panel verified my findings, and the board voted unanimously to deny her certification. Her division was officially disqualified from bidding on major regional contracts for 24 months. Without the ability to secure public projects, the division's revenue dropped by 50% within 6 months. The city's legal team moved forward with charges of forgery under California Penal Code Section 470 and breach of fiduciary duty. To avoid a public trial, Diane agreed to cooperate with the city's recovery efforts. Her division was reorganized and merged into a larger regional department. She was stripped of all operational authority and demoted to a ceremonial liaison role, with no staff and no influence. I resigned from my municipal position shortly after the audit concluded. I launched my own independent consulting practice, specializing in structural risk analysis and project feasibility modeling. Thanks to the reputation I had built among contractors and field engineers, my client list grew rapidly. I spent 5 days a week consulting for cities across 3 states, helping them audit their portfolios and train their engineering teams. During my training workshops, such as the one I held for Seattle's team, we went through practical exercises where we modeled municipal infrastructure risks. The team was amazed by the simplicity and accuracy of the spreadsheet tools I had built in my windowless basement workspace, noting how easily they prevented costly errors. My work on the certification board expanded to 4 days per week, allowing me to help set new technical standards for the entire region. My new office has a large window that looks out onto a small park, and the feeling of the morning sun on my face is a constant reminder of how far I have come from that windowless basement. I occasionally see Diane at regional conferences. She still wears her professional suits and tries to network with city officials, but the industry has moved on. Everyone knows she failed the technical certification review, and they know that the actual engineering expertise belonged to the analyst she kept in the basement. She had tried to isolate me, take credit for my intellect, and leave me stranded 2,600 miles from home. But by trying to humiliate me in Dallas, she forced me to speak to George Pearson and build the alliances that ultimately set me free. My success today is built on math I can explain and assessments I actually wrote. Her career is a hollow title, built on a foundation that dissolved the moment she was asked to show her work. Your reputation is either grounded in what you can actually do, or it is built on nothing sustainable. You can fake expertise for a while, especially in bureaucratic systems that reward seniority over competency. But eventually, someone asks you to prove it. And when that moment comes, the truth is undeniable. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your own experiences in the comments below. Your support is greatly appreciated.